Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you might be in this fine world. You are listening to the Startup Selling Show, Talking Sales with Scott Sambucci. That's me. Today's episode is a guest episode, and today's guest is a two-time guest now. Andy Paul is his name. Andy is most recently the author of a new book called Sell Without Selling Out, a guide to success on your own terms. Not only is Andy an author of this book, Andy is an author of multiple books. He's also a speaker and a podcaster. You can check out his podcast called the Sales Enablement Podcast. He is also the founder of the Sales House, and you can find him over at andypaul.com. Andy has tons of experience in the sales industry with tech startups. Every day he's working with tech companies, tech founders, folks in the sales part of the tech industry, helping them learn how to sell the right way, which is exactly why I wanted to have him on the show. A big theme of our conversation is that, we all have an opportunity of changing the way that we are approaching our sales. It's an opportunity to rethink how we engage with buyers and how we help our buyers think through the process of making a decision, as opposed to looking for ways to be self-interested, self-centric, and automate it. I think Andy's points of view are ones that many of us might be thinking and feeling ourselves as you're getting in-mails on LinkedIn, or you're getting cold emails, or you're getting cold calls. Few of those emails or in-mails or calls really feel like they're a human-focused approach or a very buyer-centric approach. It seems that most of the ways that people are selling is through automation, lots of batch and blast, lots of spray and pray, hoping that a few of those thousands of emails will lead to a meeting, and hoping that a handful of those meetings might turn to customers. And Andy's one of those people like me that just doesn't believe that that's the right way to do stuff. There's a much better way. And that's the way to do that is a more human-centric, buyer-centric way. And so that's why he wrote this book, Sell Without Selling Out, a guide to success in your own terms. So make sure you grab a copy on Amazon if you haven't already gotten a copy. And I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. So let's head over to that chat I just had with Andy, and I think you'll enjoy. Hello, Andy Paul.
All right. Gosh, it took a long time to make all the things cooperate. So how you doing?
It's the first time using Zoom. I get it.
Yeah, first time.
Got to get comfortable with these new platforms.
Yeah, something when me acknowledged that I was recording, it did not let me unmute my mic. Anyway, so
well, here we are.
Things.
Good. Apparently my mic is working because you can hear what I'm saying. Otherwise, you're a phenomenal lip reader.
Yeah. No, I'm not. I like your backgrounds. That's like the color of my cover of my new book.
Yeah. Speaking of the new book, I just both are new, actually. Your book is new. Yeah,
it's very, very similar color.
Yeah. Well, I just painted my office because I knew we were going to have this podcast interview.
There you go.
And I thought I do that for every guest, whether or not you knew that. So I look at the dominant color of everyone's color, and then I just make sure the background matches the book cover.
Very good. Very good.
That's the kind of service that we provide here at Andy.
It is. So how are things? We haven't talked in a couple of years.
We haven't talked in a couple of years. I can't believe it's been a couple of years, because the last time we spoke was just at the start of the pandemic back in 2020, and time flies. You've been busy since then. And I really want to spend as much time as you can talking, not just about the book, but the concepts in the book and your philosophy around sales, because I know you've one of the most thoughtful people I know when it comes to the profession and craft of selling.
No, thank you.
And one of the main reasons I wanted to have you back on the show. So if you're good with just like keeping things going at this point, why don't we do that?
Let's do it.
Okay.
We're on.
I had a couple of different ways that I wanted to start talking about the book, just for folks that maybe haven't come across some of your work on LinkedIn or some of your previous books or this book. When people say, "Hey, Andy Paul, what do you do?" How do you answer that question?
Author, speaker, podcaster, consultant, all of the above. Yeah, I mean, really, last couple of years has been mostly about writing and podcasting, but now we're sort of transitioning our business. Now we're meeting my son and I, who's my business partner, and we're sort of with the publication of the new book, we're getting back more into consulting and doing more speaking, and some interesting things coming up this year.
Cool. So which of those do you enjoy the most? You said author, speaker, podcaster, consultant. If there was one thing you could choose to be your favorite thing, what's the one favorite thing?
If I could be paid a lot of money to write, I would do that. But
really?
Oh, I love it. Yeah. And I mean, it can be painful, but this book in particular was just, it was sort of delayed because of the pandemic. Was well into it. So I almost had most of a first draft done when the pandemic hit. But it gave me the opportunity to sort of reflect on what path I was going down with the book and look at things that were going on and sort of, I wouldn't say wholly change directions, but a little bit. And with the aid of a fabulous editor, I was able to produce this book. So yeah, it's fun. I enjoy that process. And I enjoyed podcasting. I mean, that's been hugely rewarding personally. Just, conversations. We were 1,036 episodes, I think, this week. You get to, as you do, you get to talk to all these really interesting people that have different perspectives about this profession that we're in. And yeah, I've just learned so much over the last 7 years doing that.
Well, yeah, just having this conversation with you is a forcing function to get a copy of the book. And then I get to talk to you for 45 minutes, which otherwise as a consultant, probably pretty expensive. So now we get to talk about sales on a 101, and just a bunch of people happen to be listening later on.
Yeah.
So.
I mean, that part is fun. And yeah, I've learned so much from talking to everybody, and just, that's fun. But I do get paid to podcast, which is somewhat unusual, I think, in this world, because my podcast was acquired a couple of years ago, and yeah, it's worked out well.
Cool. So let's dig into the book a little bit, because, for the folks that didn't listen to the first interview that we did on this podcast, it's not a requirement or a precursor to this. What I will say is that people should listen to that, because I think it will give people a really solid grounding in terms of how you personally, Andy, think about sales and the sales profession, having done it now for, I won't say how many decades, but let's say many decades at this point. So where I'd like to start this conversation, Andy, is you mentioned, and I didn't know this, that you started the book and had the first draft of the book prior to the start of the pandemic back in March 2020. What was the impetus for writing this book? Because you've already written several others. What was the gap you were trying to fill, or what did you see was missing from both your personal library of books that you put out, as well as the larger scale sales books? Because there's no shortage of sales books out there, just like there's no shortage of diet books or exercise books or how to get rich books.
Right.
So what specifically, like if you could narrow it down, like what was the gap that you're seeing that emerged in the marketplace of sales books? What were people not learning that they needed to learn? What did you feel like was necessary about sitting down and going through this writing process?
Sure. Well, the big driver for me was my belief that hasn't changed, that despite all the advantages of all the technology that's available to us today, is we haven't gotten any better at selling, and that arguably maybe we've gotten worse. And so that was really, I think, the prime driver for me. It was like, hey, this is really important that we start getting it right, because the future is going to continue to evolve. It's going to look even more different than what we experienced change in the last 5-10 years. And in that environment, how does someone thrive, or how will someone thrive? And so I really want to provide, I think, a perspective about what we've sort of been doing wrong to date, and things that we could do somewhat simply to help sellers be better positioned to succeed in going into an increasingly digital future.
Yeah, and the timing of this was unintended, but I will tell you, 2 weeks ago, we interviewed Ethan Butte, who just came out with his book, Digital-Centered or Human-Centered Communication.
Human-Centered selling, yeah.
Yeah, Freudian slip there. And then we also just recently had Andy Mowat on the show, which I know you know. Yeah, I know you know both of those people. So in a way, this is almost like a series of interviews that we're having with experts like you, that's talking about, like, what are we doing wrong with all of the tech stack and digitalization and automation, and really, and also the specialization across the sales profession, where it's everything from BDR, SDR, sales associate, there's an assembly line almost that's emerged with titles. So to get more specific around what you feel like needs to happen as the world changes in the next 5 years, can you think of 2 or 3 specific, like if you were able to forecast out, this is what I'm seeing as, be a futurist a little bit, in the next 5 years, this is what selling is going to look like. And if we don't change what we're doing, this is the opportunity that's going to be missed.
Yeah, well, I think that what we've done with the advent of technology is just sort of to date is that we've used it rather than using it as an opportunity to rethink how we engage with buyers and how we help buyers through their process of making a decision. We just automated what we were doing before. And quite frankly, what we were doing before wasn't very good in terms of some of the behaviors I described in my book, what I call salesy behaviors, selling out, seller-centric, self-interested behaviors that everybody sort of is aware of what those are. And we've amplified those as a result. And so the buyer's experience with sellers, I would argue, has not improved and perhaps has degraded over the last number of years as we lean into the technology. And partly because, again, instead of using it to rethink what we're doing, we just sort of doubled down, not really closing the loop in this, the logic of saying, well, just because we can do this doesn't mean we should do it. Which I would say, hey, just because we can carpet bomb prospects with emails, should we? And to me, the answer is no. But I think what it's done is it's created for sales leaders and for sellers this environment where there's so much focus on sort of quantity over quality. And it's not the fault of the technology. I just want to be clear. It's how it's being utilized by people, is that you have these studies from Gartner and others that are saying, well, hey, buyers just don't want to talk to sellers. And see, I don't think that's new. I think buyers never want to talk to sellers. No one's ever woken up in the morning and said, hey, gosh, I hope Andy calls me today. Even though, my buyers are very friendly with my buyers, but we're sort of not helping the buyer make progress and get their job done as well as it needs to be done. And so they're saying, look, if you interact with me and you can help me, as I talk about in the book, so the basic unit of value is, can you help me make progress toward making a decision? If you can't do that in any interaction you have with the buyer, then they don't have time for you. And they will look to be more self-service in that regard.
I like that question a lot. Can you help me make progress with the sale? Because I've seen the Gartner reports and the CB Insights reports about how buyers are whatever percentage, they're 67, 75% through their purchasing process before they ever contact a seller.
I'm not sure I buy that necessarily, but
I tend to agree with you on that. But the premise is buyers don't want to talk to sellers until they're at least ready themselves to have that conversation and can feel a certain level of trust in the process that if and when I do reach out to a seller, then I want it to be targeted and I want that seller to be one that I feel like can help me make progress.
Right. But then there's also the data from those same analyst firms saying that 80% of decision makers say there's no value talking to sellers, or they get no value from talking to sellers. So we have this misalignment, right? And I think part of it's due to the fact that let's say you Google a sales process, right? And there's all this talk we've seen in the last 15 years or whatever about modern sales.
Mm-hmm.
And if you Google the selling process, as I did in the process of writing my book and doing research, is what comes up is the exact same sales process that basically existed for 50, 60 years, right? It's this linear, stage-based process. And, I think we've even doubled down to sort of saying, look, take discovery, for example, excuse me, stumble over my words here. Example is sellers look at that and think, well, okay, discovery takes place in this box. And once I'm done with it and we've got these exit criteria, then I'm done with discovery. I don't need to ask questions anymore. And it's like, well, that's not the way the world works. It's not the way buyers work. They're going to be discovering or they're going to be exploring up until the point they sign the order, right? And so we're doing a disservice to sellers by saying, this is the way buyers think of it. Implicitly, we're saying this is the way buyers think of it. And that's not the way buyers think of that process, I think, at all. They don't think of it in terms of discovery and demo and proposal and present. I mean, they look at it from, I summarize it into 3 stages. They look at it as the what stage, the how stage, and the who stage. The what stage being is, what's my problem? And what are the outcomes I can achieve by addressing it? The how stage is how are we going to address it? And how are we going to achieve the outcomes? And the last thing they're concerned about is who they're going to do that with. Whereas for most of our sellers, we train them as, your job is to go out and persuade this buyer to buy your product. It's all about the who. It's not about the what and the how. And I think that's just one example how we're fundamentally misaligned with what the buyers are trying to achieve. And they experience that as, well, this is the value I need from you to help me make progress at this point in time. And you're not delivering that. And if you can't deliver that, then I don't have time for you anymore. Right? I mean, I've invested my time in you and I'm not getting a return on that investment. So I'll talk to someone else or I'll do it on my own.
If we use that paradigm of the what, the how, and the who in that order, and overlay that very, obviously it's just like a very basic overlay to some of the Gartner numbers about whatever, 67 or 70% of the process, the purchasing process is done before they reach out. So by nature, the who piece, which you described as your the last third of that 3-step process, that comes last. How do specifically, if I'm a seller, whether I'm a CEO, founder trying to get my first customers, or I'm enterprise sales or a head of sales, how do I move myself up into stage 2 or ideally even stage 1? Because in your book, you've got these 4 sections of the book: connection, curiosity, understanding, generosity.
4 pillars, right?
These 4 pillars. So how do these 4 pillars fit into the buying or selling process that you just described?
Right. Well, think about the what stage as being, it's a marketplace of ideas or a battlefield of ideas, if you will, right? Because at this point, it's not about product. It's about, we're not even sure what our issue is, right? This is why I sort of take issue with the Gartner and Serious Decisions. All these other people have said, we got the 67%. And I have to admit, I've used that term myself in the past.
Yeah.
But the more I think about it, it's like, oh yeah, that doesn't really make sense. Because I think it's the only measure that really matters is one that's almost impossible to measure, is what percentage of their decision have they made up, right? Because how do we measure that in somebody's brain, right? That they're 70% of the way through making their decision. You can't, right? Because even Gartner talks about it in their whole buyer journey diagram, this sort of complex spaghetti diagram that they have that maps the buyer's journey. It starts and stops, and it can start over again, and it can recur. If they get a new piece of information, they can go back to the beginning and start again. So, this idea that everything's linear, like I said, just doesn't work. So the key thing you're trying to do in the what stage, in that first stage, is you're trying to reach this level of understanding of what's most important to the buyer. And I talk about this in the book. This is our job as sellers. Our job is to listen to the buyer and understand what are the most important things to them, maybe in terms of both the challenges they're trying to address and the outcomes they want to achieve. And it's our job to help them think more deeply and broadly about what both those are, right? That I think is one of the things they're most looking for from sellers. They don't need facts and figures. They don't need your specs. They can get that from your website. What they need is somebody to help them think about what it is they're trying to do. Give them a different perspective on that. And if you're unable to do that, then I think you're at a real competitive disadvantage. And so this is not, some people say, well, that's the challenger sale. Well, there's elements of that, but it's not like even challenging necessarily a preconceived notion they have. You're really helping them explore and think differently. And I think the self-aware buyers, and I know because my own experience, they want that, right? They know that they're subject to sort of groupthink internally. And we've been thinking about things this way. And the self-aware buyer knows, well, let's bring the experts in and let's have them help us think about this. But I think the really important thing you're trying to get done in that what stage is come to this level of understanding. And then the second part of that, I talk about in books, is our job as sellers to understand what's the most important things to the buyer. And the second part of that is, and then help them get that, right? So once you've helped them identify what this is, then our job is how do we help them get that? And that really is where sort of the how stage comes in, right? Because that's when we're going to be helping them through the trade-offs and choices they make about how to achieve their desired outcome.
Yeah. So like, as you were talking about that, Andy, I was going back to that 3-step paradigm, the what, the how, the who, and then the overlay with the Gartner data. To say that buyers don't reach out to sellers until they're 67% of the way through, candidly, is, I guess you could almost disprove that by saying, well, what about when people download a white paper or sign up for a webinar or download, start viewing articles or subscribe to a newsletter or go to a conference? Whether the buyer may say, I'm not engaging in sellers, maybe they mean, I'm not calling up a salesperson and asking for the demo.
Right.
but they are engaging, right? They're getting
Sure.
this information, and that's the digital selling aspect of what needs to happen. So by default, that first signal, whether it's download white paper, join webinar, sign up for conference, that's the opportunity, if I'm hearing you right, that the salesperson has to begin thinking about these four pillars around making the connection and being curious
Right.
and understanding and being generous. Is that the
Yeah.
right way to think about it based on what you're
Well,
modeling?
yeah, in part. I mean, I think the baseline for the book, I believe, is really how do we create positive buying experiences for the buyer that differentiates us? Is that I believe, especially in this is true, I think, in the software world for sure, is that in most categories, your ability to establish and maintain any sort of substantial differentiation is really hard, right? So customer says, geez, we're really interested in, this particular piece of software, and we're going to talk to, 3 to 5 vendors, and oh my gosh, they basically all do the same thing.
Mm.
And I really believe that it's their experience, and Gartner has substantiated this with their research, and I think Forrester has as well, as their ultimate decision is based in large measure on their interactions with the sellers. You become the point of differentiation. So even though they may have done a bunch of their research and downloaded a white paper and so on, is when they finally decide, look, I'm willing to invest time in you as a seller. Doesn't matter at what point they are in their process, you as a seller still have to establish that connection. You still have to build that level of credibility and trust. You still have to be able to ask questions and deploy your curiosity that enable you to get to a point of understanding what is most important to the buyer. So I think that when people think about this idea as, oh, well, they're 67% of the way through their buying process, like, well, yeah. So what's that mean is when you engage with them, you still have to go through all these steps again, right? You still have to, as a seller, you still have to build that connection, rapport, the trust. So that's why I think it's a little bit of a false flag, that 67% number, because it's not meaningful, really. I think in a real sense, if you're a seller and you engage with the buyer at that point, it's like starting at the 0 point.
So if we could get like really specific and
Sure.
just almost like a post-it note style, what would be examples of, I think a lot of people come up with negative examples or negative interactions with salespeople, right? Seller downloads white paper, or buyer downloads white paper, seller immediately calls or sends a calendar invite for booking a demo. Choose from my calendar for any 1 hour block and let me know who else I should invite.
Right.
And that's a negative, sort of like overwhelming interaction. So what would be some examples though of what you would consider maybe as like really small examples of positive interactions when you do have that first couple of touch points, you do have the ability to make a connection, to be curious? What are some things that you've seen sellers do? And it could be really, really small example.
Sure.
I'm just curious to give people some ideas of what we're talking about in terms of being positive in your interactions.
Right. Be interested in them, right? Don't pitch, lead with questions. I mean, people are always sort of interested in, hey, what do you do? But in this case, you give the example you gave is that's not a question, right? They've downloaded your white paper here. Somebody's picked up the phone. They know what you do. So when you first have a chance to interact with the buyer, what do you want to do? What do you want to do? Well, what you want to do is you want to learn about them more than anything else, right? That's really should be your mission. Is I'm here to understand what's most important to you. So I want to lead with a question. And that question could be something, I talk about this in the book. It could be, one example of the question type I put in there is I call an insight question. And so the insight question is, I'm going to ask the buyer something about their business that they might reasonably be expected to know, but possibly don't, right? So this gives the buyer pause. They're going to think, oh, that's interesting. They're thinking this, right? This person has something on the ball. Yeah, I want to, it's sort of a trigger for them to say, yeah, let's have a conversation about that.
What would be an example of an insight question? Like if you could just pick
well, I'll give you one from my own business that I do.
Please.
So, I consult and sales consulting, advisory services, oftentimes CEOs as clients. And so one that I like to use, because I'm a huge believer in this idea of what I call true productivity in sales, is I'll ask a CEO, so tell me, how many hours on average does one of your sellers spend to take a customer from initial point of contact to a close? they really should know this, because without this knowledge, you really don't understand what your true productive capacity is as a sales organization. No one does. And it's like trigger, it's a conversation. It's like, oh, why is that important to me? Right? Why should I know that? And then we start talking about that. And they say, well, this guy knows what he's talking about. We hadn't thought about that before. How could that apply to our business? And then off we go. So that's just an example. But as companies, this is not really up to the sellers to come up with these questions, an insight question per se. I mean, a more senior seller would, because they'll be in touch with how their customers are really driving value from the product and services. But that's what you have to do is collectively say, look, how are our customers using our product? We got that. But what sources of unexpected value have they found in using our product and service? So in my mind, there's always there, right? Something they didn't anticipate when they were doing their evaluation of products, they made their decision. And then 6 months down the road, it's like, oh, wow, this is really how we're using it. And I've seen that time and time again in my careers. Customer puts out maybe, I worked on some really big deals. Customers down selected 3 vendors. They put out a final requirements document. You'd bid on it. You'd win the business. And then 12 months later, they're not using anything that they bid on or that you bid on. They're using something completely different. And that's where they're making all their money, getting all the return on so that just happens. So you need to be in tune and say, well, what are those? Your CS people or your marketing people, whatever, product marketing people have to be on top of that and have to be aware of how that's happening. And then they feed that back to sellers or enablement in the form of, hey, this is the type of question that would be interesting to ask, because it's going to cause the buyer to stop and think, and may even do a little reflection or research on what's happening in their business. We come across as thoughtful individuals that they want to have a conversation with.
All right, folks, we are off and running with Andy Paul. Like I said, he just wrote his book, Sell Without Selling Out. And I think if you're a startup founder or you're in sales, it's a huge opportunity for you to learn from somebody who has a lot of experience. That's also the reason that we run our sales coaching program here at Sales Quality. Not only do I have decades of experience selling in tech, selling in the startup world, selling to large companies, but our coaches and our contributors, people that come in as guest experts, people like Todd Capone and Aaron Ross and Mary Lou Tyler and others that have come in and taught to our clients their specialization, their expertise. It's a way for all of us as a community to share our shared experience to our clients, people just like you that are running and growing B2B tech startups. So if you're one of those companies that's trying to think through how to get to the next level with your business, maybe it's just you're at a point where you're trying to get some more repeatability in your sales process, or maybe you've got some repeatability, but you haven't figured out how to scale that sales process. Maybe you don't have the right people in the right seats. Maybe you have a hard time hiring. Maybe you haven't figured out how to get away from founder-led selling and get to founder-less selling. Well, those are all the reasons that we do what we do every single day here at Sales Qualia. So definitely suggest, look, even if you want to get a second set of eyes on your strategies, your systems, and you want to get some perspective on how you might think through the next phase of growth for your startup, let's hop on a quick call. Whether or not you're a fit for the program, whether or not you're a fit for us, chances are one or another, a quick call could lead to a couple ideas for you to implement right away for your startup. So the easiest way for you to do that, shoot me an email, scott@salesqualia.com, scott@salesqualia.com. Just type the word private into the subject line that lets me know, lets my team know that you want to have a quick private conversation with me about your situation so we can work on a few ideas. And then if there's a way for us to work together after that, we can always talk about how that works. But in the meantime, if you want to get a little help, brainstorm a few ideas and get you on your way, then let's have a quick chat. Okay? Well, that's it for now. Let's head back to my conversation with Andy Paul.
Yeah, I really like that approach for a couple of reasons. That you hearkened me back to when I was first an outside sales rep selling college textbooks. So back in the late 90s. Yeah. So in 1996, I graduated from college. That fall, I got a job at what used to be Prentice Hall Publishing, and now it's Pearson Education. And my job was I had a territory of universities in Western North Carolina. It's about 25 or so accounts. My job was to talk to professors about what books they're going to use for the next year. And usually those sales you're kind of locked in for a 3-year sale because you get it in a new edition, and then they'd use that edition until it's up for a new edition. I got hired in the fall, and my sales manager said, look, it's too late for you to make any impact on sales for this calendar year.
Fall, right, yeah.
So all I want you to do for your first 2 months is go to campuses and talk to people already using our books and ask them what they like about the book, or what do they like about working with us, and what else would they like to see. And by default, and I think he did this on purpose, all he was doing was indoctrinating me with why, well, number one, why our books are so great. Because the only feedback I was getting was from users. And they're like, oh my God, I love this, college algebra book. And here's why the problem sets in the back of the book are so good. Or, the instructor's manual is excellent, or whatever. This is the only book that covers this topic this way, which was good for me. But then it just got me sold on selling product. More importantly, when I was then going out in the spring, starting in January, to sell books for the following fall, I was just basically parroting what I heard back in the fall when I talked to the next college algebra professor. I'm like, oh, well, we have another professor at this school who's using it. And this is what he said about the book. Like, how are you handling this chapter? Because that professor said chapter 5 is a really tough topic for most students. Like, how are you handling it? So it gave me an arsenal of questions to ask, even though I knew nothing about what it meant to teach college algebra. Because what would I know about it? I was a history major.
Right. Me too. I think we may have talked about that before. I was a history major.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So, and we've also, with our clients, sometimes we'll have them do what we call client interviews. Because to your point, the reason people buy a product isn't the reason that they get value from it. As they use it, they learn how to adapt their business to it. Or, oh, I didn't think I was going to need this integration. I didn't think I was going to need this feature.
Exactly.
But now that we're using it, it's like, holy cow, I'm really glad that we have it.
Yeah. I mean, I learned this very early in my career as selling computer systems to construction companies in the East Bay Area, the San Francisco Bay Area. And had this, what at the time was largest deal I'd ever gotten. And it was a big construction company way out in the East Bay. And they put us through the ringer, right? Us and the competition, and multiple levels of demos. And then they had a final requirements document we all bid on. And it was for accounting packages running on their computer. And job cost accounting, everything. And I remember going back to talking to the CEO about, 6-8 months after we had installed the system. And he was only running billing. We had done accounts payable, accounts receivable, job cost accounting, all these things, only running billing. And he said, so, well, damn, you put me through the hoops on that. He goes, yeah, but this is how we're paying for the system. This was the most important. And we never really found out that was the most important, right? We sort of assumed everything was sort of equally as important. And so for me, it's big eye-opening moment about, hey, there's always one thing that's more important than everything else with your buyer. Your job as a seller is to understand what that is, right? And who it's most important to and what it will mean to them if you can help them achieve that. But we just don't emphasize that. And so that's what I talk about in the book is, our job is to understand what those most important things are and then help them get it. And if we take that approach to it and that attitude toward it, then the buyer's experience with us is completely different than as we're just out there pushing a product, assuming that we are the answer to their problem.
We go back to the what stage, being stage one. So now you got me thinking about this concept of what's the one most important thing? Because if buyers, are just starting their sort of needs analysis and figuring out what the problem is, they might either not know what that one thing is, or false, perception of oh, I really need this feature because it's the thing that's going to help me solve this problem. So there's some perception to be correct or most likely incorrect in a lot of cases if it's early stage. How do we as sellers get down to that one thing early in the process, or how do we work through that to get to that place? Yeah,
I think that it's not always evident that it'll come out that early, right? It's nice. Oftentimes it does, depending on the level of thought they put into it. But this I think is the hallmark of good sellers, is you stay engaged, right? You understand that as the customer goes through their buying journey, they're becoming smarter on multiple dimensions about not only necessarily what their problem is or the problems are, but also the outcomes they potentially can achieve. And you're playing a role in that. And they're talking to competitors, they're playing a role in that. So you have to keep asking the questions, right? Keep challenging them to think differently about perhaps, or add some insight into what they're thinking about. And you don't necessarily even have to have ultimately the right answer. It's really about how you help them get to that point. Because what are they going to remember? I harken back to Daniel Kahneman, and I wrote about this in my second book. He did the research that he'd come up with this idea of what he called the peak end rule, that when people go through an experience and look back about making a decision on that experience, is they factor into two primary things. One is the peak event during that experience and the last event during that experience. So if you're able to help the buyer think differently or come to an insight about what their problems are and what the potential outcomes they can achieve, that's memorable to the buyer, right? That works to your advantage. And here's the thing that's also in the book is that this idea we talked about before is every time you interact with the buyers, they're making an investment of time and attention in you. Is you can't predict ahead of time as a seller which interaction you'll have with them will be the most memorable for them, will be that peak event. So you have to be intentional about being on top of your game, but bringing something of value to them every time you ask them to invest time and attention in order to help them make progress toward making a decision. Otherwise, they're going to look at the interactions with you as not having value, not being worth their time.
I really like this peak end concept in sales. Just this past weekend, as an example, my son did a soccer tournament. We did a first traveling soccer tournament. So,
exciting!
Yeah, big deal, right? Exciting. And turns out the peak event didn't have anything to do with 3 soccer games that we played. And even though we lost all 3 games, the worst experience had nothing to do with winning or losing those games.
Going to McDonald's afterwards.
The peak experience was getting to run around the hotel pool in between games and eat pizza.
Yeah,
that was the peak experience. And the memorable experience that he might remember, the end experience was the drive home, getting from San Mateo back to Davis. He's like, oh, this is kind of a long drive. I'm really hungry. I'm going to go home and see my other friends.
Right.
But it's just common human behavior, which is why Daniel Kahneman obviously was publishing about it. But if we think about that, to your point about like trying to get to that one thing, trying to be prepared and understand insights, that's where having almost like a list of possible one things based on your interaction with previous buyers, say, hey, when we work with buyers, we know there's not just one peak for all buyers. Different buyers have different peaks. And so if I hadn't have enough experience, I almost have like a pick list that I can use as a mechanism to ask good questions to see how much buyers are kind of leaning into that one thing. And that helps me winnow down. Okay, there's 5. Our history with buyers has been, it's usually one of these 3 or one of these 5 or the peak. So let me figure out what it might be for this one buyer.
Yeah, I mean, it's useful doing that. The only caution I give to people about that is that everybody is different, right?
That's a good point. I'm already trying to box it, and I shouldn't be doing that.
There's a tendency to say, yeah, I want everybody to put everybody in a box, right? You're like somebody else I spoke to before, and that has value to a point, but only to a point, right? Because we're one of 7 billion people in the world talking to another person who's one of 7 billion, and the way they look at the world and react and interact with us will be different than anybody else on that planet. So I believe this is one of the problems that we sort of leaned into as a profession, certainly in tech sales. Say, look, hey, this person, nominally qualified buyer, they fit our ICP. This is the persona. We know, as you said from the past, that if we ask these questions, we're starting to get these answers. Sure. Yeah, you can do that, and you might win a certain small percentage of your deals. But it's the ability to go beyond that and to say, look, it's not enough to know what this buyer might say. It's not enough to collect, information from asking our sort of standard set of questions. What do I really understand about the buyer? What do I really understand about their challenges? What do I understand about this person, this individual who's a member of the buying committee? What do I really understand about their motivations and what's important to them? Not just as a corporate decision maker, but as an individual, what this impact this choice will have on them. So this idea of taking things to a level of understanding, it means that you really can't assume anything, and nor should you. And I think, again, I talk about intentionality. I think this is really such a key part of it, right? Is that we're in a game that requires us to be thoughtful every single interaction we have with the buyer about what can we do for the buyer now that's going to help them move closer to making a decision. And that is a question we should be able to ask about every qualified opportunity in our pipeline. And if we don't know the answer to it, then that's problematic. It means we need to go back and continue to ask questions and dig in and see what we've missed. Because I think you get, I don't know, depends on the deal you sell, how transactional, how complex it is, on either end of the spectrum. But you may find that you have a handful of opportunities to actually interact with the buyer in the course of a buying journey. Can you afford to sacrifice any one of those? by not being prepared, by not really understanding the buyer and how you're going to help them get to where they want to go? I don't think so. And so that's back to the point before, is you can't predict in advance what is going to be the peak event for the buyer during their buying journey. I had a client years ago, and I wrote about this in my first book, is did a good job, developed a lot of inbound lead flow with the right type of customers. And they did proactive outbound some, but we really trained them up so that when their inside sales team, so when they got a lead, they responded quickly. We made sure people really understood the product. They actually stole people from engineering and they turned them into inside sales reps. And as a result, the customers are finding their first conversations in response to submitting a lead or entering a information on a form was with somebody who really knew what they were talking about and who could ask great questions, because oftentimes, as I said, they had been engineers. This was for a test product. They had been engineers, so they could sort of guide the buyer through in the course of a half hour. They got to the point where the buyer is basically begging for a demo. And we trained them to to say no. I'll talk about that in a second. Because, the buyer said, always want to say, could we schedule a demo? And I trained them to say no, but we can do it right now. And here, send them at that time a GoToMeeting link, and they'd do the demo on the spot. But the result is that when we surveyed the buyers, I surveyed their customers. We did this, I engaged this client for a long time. So every 6 months, we surveyed their buyers about their experience with my clients' sellers. Okay, not one loss analysis, just this experience of dealing with the sellers. And the peak event in the vast majority of cases was that first interaction.
Wow.
And we tend to think as sellers that, we're building up, right? It's cumulative effect. No, it could be just how responsive you are on that following up on the first lead. That sets you apart. The first impression you make, that could be the deciding thing. And I talk about in the book, for me, working for startups, selling large complex systems, competing against mega companies, what we often won is because we made the customer feel understood. Seems simple. Didn't happen on the first call, but that was their thing for us. It was most memorable. Yeah, these guys get us, and they understand exactly what we're trying to do. That's how you win deals.
To ask a question through the lens of a startup founder. So imagine I'm a B2B, tech product selling to the enterprise. If I'm early stage, like true early stage, even trying to get my first 10 customers. So in that case, the founder is the sales team.
Better be.
Or maybe a little, yeah. And that's why I want to get to this in a moment. I knew you were going to feel that way. And even further, okay, I have 10 customers. Now I'm trying to get to 1 million or from 1 to 3. Even if that founder isn't the sales process, they're still going to be very heavily involved with sales as the account executive or very deeply involved with most customer sales, or should be. So if we use that as just a baseline for this question through that lens, everything that we just talked about for the last 20 minutes about insight-based questions, understanding customer outcomes and peak experiences, knowing how to ask good questions, knowing that the peak experience might be that first interaction. If I'm that person, I could feel a certain level of anxiety and fear, and all of those reasons may further justify why, as a startup founder, I just need to hire the salespeople to go do this for me, because, oh my gosh, like Andy just described, probably what could take years of learning and experience to get to that place. But I've got a 9-month runway with this seed round, or I got to get to 3 million in revenue by the next 12 months, or I'm not going to be able to close a Series A. What would be your message to those people that could fully agree with you 100%? Yep, I should be doing those things, but like I got to grow sales fast, and I'm a tech founder with an engineering background or a product background or a financial background. I don't know how to do all those things, so I'm just going to outsource it.
Yeah, and that problems on multiple levels with that, right? So one is when you're going out to get your, I'll call it anchor clients, right? The first ones, the first 10, is no one's going to represent the company with the same level of passion and emotion and excitement than you as a founder. And I don't care if you are an engineer. I mean, there's no mystery to selling. This is the thing I say in the book, and I say all the time, is anybody can do it. I mean, I've converted many of engineers into sellers, and they'll say, well, I'm no good. I'm an engineer. I don't know how to convince people to do something they don't want to do. I said, well, that's good, because that's not the job of a seller. Your job is to help them solve a problem. You solve problems every day, don't you, as an engineer? Yeah, great. That's all we're doing here. We're going to solve problems for customers. So founders, you get that. And you know the product. You had this vision of who's going to use it and how. Communicate that. No one's going to be stronger communicating that to a potential buyer than a founder in the first stages of the company. And so for me, like I remember times like at one company where, I was hired as VP, starting a new division within the company. I was the one employee of that division at that time. And I'd bring the founder with me as much as I could because you could just tell the story better, right? And relate to where things were going, vision for the product, all these things that customers potentially want to hear. So there's no excuses. You just got to get out there. And whether you come from a sales background, an engineering background, just is immaterial. You're just talking to people. You're not selling. You're having conversations. You're trying to understand what's most important to them, how you can help them. And that is the perspective. Yeah, if you thought your job was go out and persuade them to buy it, that's not going to work. Your job's to go have a conversation. Understand what's the most important to them. You can do that. So founders, do that. Because then you'll also get a sense of what it takes to sell the product. Because the other thing you oftentimes see, and not just in startups, it happens in companies in general, but perhaps more accentuated in startups, is CEO is just completely out of touch in terms of what it takes to actually sell the product. And that creates a lot of issues as well. So the more the founder can be deeply involved in that, the better. That will evolve. As they grow, that process will evolve. They'll become more sophisticated in certain dimensions. But I think gives the founder a little bit of empathy for what the sellers have to go through in order to make it happen.
It's easier to turn an engineer into a salesperson than a salesperson into an engineer.
Well, that's for sure. But it's just, that's because I talk about this in the book. Because we just have this wrong perspective about what selling is.
Yeah.
Your job as a seller is not to go out and persuade somebody to buy your product. If you think it is, you're wrong. That's not it. And unfortunately, we continue to perpetuate that in the way we train and enable people. Your job as a seller, which again, salesperson, engineer, anybody that's really has a responsibility of influencing an outcome, working through somebody else, your job is just to go listen to people, listen to your buyers, understand what the most important things to them, and then help them get it. I mean, that's pretty simple. That's all we do.
And probably a pretty good reason why somebody like that should buy a copy of the book.
Exactly why they should buy multiple copies of the book for everybody on their team. Yes.
For everyone on the team, including the engineers.
Including the engineers. Well, but this is really, when you think about it, the pillars of selling in, we work in an environment where collaboration is increasingly important. And Dan Pink talked about this, 10 years ago when his book To Sell is Human. 75% of white collar workers identify themselves as needing to work with or through other people, influencing other people to get their job done. So it's increasingly that way. But some studies shown that some experts, futurists, thinking that, one of the critical skills of the future is going to be the ability to collaborate. This is how we collaborate. We collaborate by saying, okay, we're working with these people to get a job done. I want to understand what's most important to this person, how I can help them get that. Because if I do that, then that's going to help me get what I want. And this person, the same thing. And so, this is really a book for anybody that works, I think, in general, in sort of the information economy these days. Is how do you get your job done? How do you collaborate with other people?
Love it. I think that's a good place for us to wrap up here, Andy. So obviously people can get a copy of the book, Sell Without Selling. Where's the best place for them to, do you want them to go to Amazon? Do you want them to go to your website? Where can they get in touch with you if they want to get even more help?
So title of the book, Sell Without Selling Out. And Amazon, wherever you buy books, most people seem to go to Amazon, it seems like these days. They can come to my website, andypaul.com. And we've got bonuses for people that buy the book. We've got a fun little assessment for people to take to sort of see if they're create a spectrum between selling out on one end and selling in on the other, and where they might sit on that spectrum. It's not hugely serious, just sort of a fun indicator of that. And then, follow me on LinkedIn or connect with me on LinkedIn. I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, not to mention the podcast.
Oh yeah, the podcast. Thank you. Yes. Bosses would not like that. Sales Enablement podcast with Andy Paul is 1,036 episodes. So still going strong. Yeah, we're just getting started. Yeah. Well, it's well, as you do it. It's been so much fun because we just continue to learn a lot from all these various perspectives. And one of the things we're focusing on this coming year in 2022 is giving more exposure to new voices in sales, because that's one of my passions, is developing the next generation of thought leaders in sales. And so, we're going to be devoting more episodes to, people just sort of making their name and have new interesting perspectives to share.
I love that. Well, Andy, thanks so much for taking time out of your day to talk about the book. Thanks for writing another book.
Oh, thank you, Scott.
To learn from you. I know I certainly enjoyed getting a copy. I'm going to go back and read it again based on after I've talked with you, because I feel like I'm going to have a different perspective on what I'm learning.
Oh, good.
In the book. Because when you read through it once, you're like, okay, these are good ideas, but then you get to talk to the person and you understand the why behind some of these pillars, for example.
Well, it's one of the things we've heard so far from people that have bought the book and read it is actually they are rereading it, which to me, that may be the most gratifying thing I hear, is that they go through it again.
Yeah. And then in maybe 6 months, we'll have you back on the show so you can talk about
We'd love to.
The benefits that people have gotten from the book that you didn't expect they were going to get from the book, just like we talked about.
Well, but that's absolutely true. People ask me, okay, well, as you have, what's the book about, right? And I answer in all sincerity, this is not new to me. I mean, authors do this all the time. It's like, well, let me see what people think after they've read it, because they tell me things that I didn't necessarily see when I was writing it that had a lot of value for them. And it's happened with my first 2 books. And I'm sure it'll happen here.
Well, thanks again, Andy. Really appreciate it. We'll put a link to the book on the show notes, a link over to you and your website, LinkedIn as well. Definitely follow Andy, listen to the Sales Enablement podcast, get a copy of the book or 10 copies of the book for your team. And we'll have you back on in a few months to tell us what you've learned from the people that have read it. Sound good?
Thanks, Scott.
All right, Andy. Thanks again. Have a great rest of the day. We'll talk soon.
You too.
That is a wrap. Andy's a really good guy. Just enjoy the conversation. I love his approach. Very cerebral and very human-centric, as we talked about throughout the course of the conversation. Hope you found him engaging, just like I did. And if you haven't already bought a copy of Sell Without Selling Out, make sure that, in fact, you do that. As we come up to the end of this episode of the podcast, I want to say thank you for being a listener. If you haven't already subscribed, make sure you subscribe to the podcast, whether it's on Apple Podcasts or on Amazon or Spotify or wherever you're listening. Do also please tell a friend or 10, shoot them a copy of this, a link to this episode. Let them know you've been listening to the Startup Selling Show, and that it's been a great way for you to develop and grow as a startup founder when it comes to sales and strategy. And of course, leave us a review. Let us know how we're doing. If there's a guest that you want to hear or a topic you want us to cover, you can either leave a review or, again, shoot me an email, Scott@salesqualia, Qualia, Scott@salesqualia.com. And I will do my very best to meet that request. And again, if you want to have a conversation about your startup, work on a couple of ideas, you can also send me an email, Scott@salesqualia.com. Type the word private into the subject line, and we will hop on the phone ASAP. All right, that's it for now. Thanks so much for listening to this next or most recent episode of the Startup Selling Show, Talking Sales with Scott Sambucci. Until next time, happy selling. See ya.